Good evening and welcome. My name's Ian Lowe. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are all on the lands of various groups of First Australians, that sovereignty was never ceded, it always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Julie Mackin has been running a wonderful series of talking authors, but tonight the shoe is on the other foot, and she is being rebadged as an author, and I'm delighted to have the privilege of talking to her about her wonderful and very important book. Julie, you start your book by pointing out that our ill treatment of refugees is inhumane, bordering on torture. And it worries me that anyone under the age of 40 might think 'twas ever thus, because for certainly the last 25 years, that has been the way we have operated. But those of us who have done more laps of the sun can remember a time when Australia was actually quite generous to refugees, whether it was people fleeing the devastation in Europe at the end of World War II, or more recently when the Fraser government recognised that we'd colluded with the Americans in encouraging people in the south of Vietnam to take arms against their fellow countrymen in the north. And at the end of that war, their government recognised that we had some responsibility to treat people in the south who then feared for their safety, being on the losing end of the American war. So, how did we get in this situation where we treat refugees so badly? And why do we discriminate between those who arrive in aircraft and those who arrive in leaking boats? Because the refugees from Vietnam, some came on commercial airline flights, but others arrived braving shark-infested waters in leaky boats. And they were all treated as asylum seekers, as refugees, exercising the universal right that all humans have to seek asylum if they feel unsafe where they are. Why did we move away from that?
So, yeah, I think the only reason I could write this book is because there's the reason why I wrote it, and what made it possible to write this book is because we used to be different. We have changed in my lifetime. And I know I look 21, but I'm not. I'm just not 21. But in my lifetime, we have gone from being a country that actually used to kind of strut the world stage, showing off to the rest of the world about what a humane, sophisticated country, how a humane and sophisticated country behaved. And we were drawing on a really deep legacy in that with Doc Evatt and our really great contribution post 1945. So we were once a different country. I had the pleasure of interviewing Malcolm Fraser before he died, and I said to him, "How come? Under the Fraser government, about 80,000 people came from Vietnam as refugees." And I said to him, "How did you manage to do that? And we didn't have civil war. We didn't have everyone losing their minds." And in fact, a friend of mine came out in that cohort of people, and she used to say she really loved being in Villawood, and I was really shocked and she said, "Mate, it was so fantastic. There were all the kids. We had the bikes. We had the bands. It was a real community." And we supplied English lessons and trauma counselling and all of that. Anyway, I asked Malcolm how he managed to do it. And he said in that beautiful, actually, patrician voice of his, he said, "Julie, I did it because I was the leader. And leaders make decisions like that. I wasn't going to ask people if they thought that was a good idea. And I did it because it was the right thing to do." And that was the end of it, right? We used to live in Australia where doing something because it was the right thing to do was self-explanatory. And, you know, and how I got to write the book was because there was a break in the way we understood ourselves as a nation. And in that break of understanding ourselves as a nation, we began to get in contact with actually how we have become a nation. And just like for an individual, any nation that walks around having no idea where they came from or what they look like or what their favorite color is, they're going to be in trouble. You know, you're not going to travel too well. So you have to tell me to shut up at some point, and because I will simply keep talking.
Well,
But
the key point is, when did it change and why did it change?
yeah, I think it, I think it changed for the first time. It changed for the better in the early 1970s under Whitlam. And the changes that began to roll through Australia from that point on, I argue in the book, were initiated by First Nations people who had been banging on the door of white Australia for so long, with the truth of who we were and with the demands for recognition and acknowledgement. And under Whitlam, we began to hear that story. Non-Indigenous Australians began to hear that. And because we began to hear that, things began to move within the broader community. At the same time, there was land rights, there was women's rights, there were gay rights, there was a whole lot of ferment. In the book, I talk about this in psychoanalytic terms, and I talk about it in psychoanalytic terms because I have never found a better way to understand it. And, you know, as a journalist and an activist, I have tried to avoid understanding this as a psychological position because that seems problematic. But I found no other way to understand it except to say that in the early 70s, we began to come to grips with the truth of who we were as a nation and our foundations. And as a consequence of that, getting in contact with the truth, this incredible vitality and chaos and erotic energy in the broadest sense of the term was ignited across Australia. As we come to terms with who we are, we also recognise the humanity of others. The two things are intimately linked. So we began to, so of course it made it good sense for the 80,000 Vietnamese to come here. And a whole lot of other consequences flowed on from that. When that changed for the worse was 1996. Not to put too fine a point on it, but and a lot of people will remember this interview, when John Howard, who described himself as Lazarus with a triple bypass, no one on the planet thought John Howard had a snowflake's hope in hell when he was reignited as, you know, the leader of the opposition again. And he did that Four Corners interview with Liz Jackson, where he made that famous line. Liz Jackson had said to him, you know, you've got Paul Keating on one hand, Mr. Vision, Mr. Fantastic, Mr., you know, tall, elegant, cool. And frankly, what is your vision for Australia? And Howard says, I want Australia to be relaxed and comfortable on condition that we stop looking back. And he really, in that interview, he tied together being relaxed and comfortable with no longer looking back to our past. And I argue in the book that Sigmund Freud characterizes these psychological moves as moving from a position of mourning with its heartbreak and humanity and reality to a position of melancholia with its narcissism, its sadism, and its endless self-referencing. And then we move to that. I should draw breath at this point, Ian.
I think it's clear to me that things changed fundamentally with John Howard. I mean, Paul Keating had made his Redfern speech, which might talk about later, about acknowledging our past. John Howard announced that he was going to turn his back on the past. But in my mind, the critical incident was Tampa in 2001. Can
Mm.
you remind people
Yeah,
not as old and decrepit as you and I what that incident was and what it meant?
yeah, I will. And just a heads up too, it's 25 years this year since Tampa. And I've been involved in working with a documentary series that'll come out in June or August that is looking at that week in Australia's history. Um, the Tampa, up until that point, at that point, I was a journalist at the Financial Review, and I was covering this strange thing that was happening where boatloads of people were washing up on the shores of the Northern Territory in Western Australia. And we were kind of covering that like, isn't this amazing? These people are washing up here and they're surviving, and First Nations people would find them and look after them. And it was a kind of classic, curious but lovely story, right? And then things began to get uncomfortable. Howard was casting around to work out how to stop the surge of One Nation. And if this is reminding you of the present, yeah, some things never change. And Pauline Hanson had had her "We're going to be swamped by Asian" speech. She'd kind of let racism off the leash on that because it wasn't jumped on, and Howard was playing it pretty a liberal approach to her racism. Um, it was coming up to the federal election. Howard was flagging in the polls. Kim Beazley was out in front, looked like Labor had been returned, looked like this experiment we had with this suburban solicitor from Wollstonecraft was over, and we were going to get back to the Australia that we once were. And he was really on the ropes. And then this big merchant ship, the Tampa, rescued 438 people who had been trying to get to Australia by boat. Their boat was stricken. They were in risk of drowning. And thank God, Captain Arnie rescued these 430 people. They all came on board. And he thought, quick, I'll go to the nearest shore. That was Australia, of course. He started making way to Australia, and suddenly the Australian government said, you can't come, stand off. And he said, there are people here who are sick without water and food. I can't look after this many people. I'll go to Christmas Island. He got 12 kilometres off Christmas Island, and suddenly they looked out. So they drop anchor there. They're waiting for clearance to come into Christmas Island. This is Slimebagsville, and we should all know where we're up to at this point. So what's happening in Australia is the federal government is jamming the signal off the Tampa, so the Tampa can't speak to its origin country and can't speak to anyone else. They're off 12 kilometres off Christmas Island. The people on board are desperately sick, and there are young babies there as well. So the captain is frightened. And then he says to them, look, I'm coming into Christmas Island. I can't manage these people. And they said, whoa, 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 we're going to send you out supplies of medicine, food, and water. We'll send that out to you. Just stay where you are. So all of a sudden, these big inflatables were launched from Christmas Island, and they came out, and everyone's thinking, thank God, we're going to get the medicine we need. And they look closer, and of course, it's not food, it's not medicine, it's not water, it's the SAS. The army boards the ship. The refugees are terrorised. The Tampa is in trouble. And then we had that huge standoff. So and I go to that detail of telling that story because in that process, Australia shifted its view from being a nation that viewed refugees through a humanitarian lens of food, water, and medicine to a nation that was now framing up asylum seekers as a national security issue that needed to be dealt with through the SAS. That changed Australia. It gave John Howard 10 percentage point lift in the polls. So he was roaring along now. Suddenly this man, this little suburban solicitor, was this John Howard man of iron holding the line against these invading barbarians. Australians loved it. There were lawyers going into court to work out what's going on there. They were eventually successful in court, and they failed utterly because by then Howard had passed the. Did anyone hear that really horrible staticky noise?
I'm sorry, there's rain on my roof.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Ian. It's not horrible. It's just rain. I get that. But by then, that he had passed what became known as the Pacific Solution. He'd done a deal with Manus and Nauru, and these people were shipped off there. And he looked like a legend, and Australians were allowed to breathe a deep sigh of relief and go, thank God, because we're safe.
So what happens now?
Yeah.
People, to those people and those who more recently have tried to get here in leaky boats.
Yeah. So the problem with this is if we take the psychological life of the nation seriously, we need to understand that there is no point of stasis in the psyche of anyone, including a nation. We are moving forward or we are moving backwards. And because we collectively, and I'm assuming most people on this call will say not me, but for the second, collectively, Australia had agreed to the deal. We won't look back. We will be relaxed and comfortable. So having made that deal with the devil, this is how we get the fulfillment of that contract. We get to manage our anxieties, our fears, our resentments, our envy, and our sense of not belongingness. We need to put that somewhere because that exists. First Nations people in 1997 at the Reconciliation Conference had turned their back on John Howard and refused to accept the projection that he would have them wear on our behalf. They said no to that. So we still needed someone to carry this stuff for us. And what we found was asylum seekers to carry it on our behalf. That meant we load them up with all of our stuff, all of our psychological, our dispossessed elements, and we push them out to sea and hope they never come back. That's how we deal with it. Not sure if you can hear me, Ian. Nope. Kaylee, has Ian's screen frozen?
Yes, it looks like we may have lost Ian.
Okay, well, luckily I can talk amongst myself.
We do actually have a couple of questions in the chat if you would like to address them while we wait for Ian to get back online.
Yeah. Okay, why don't I start with the idea? Okay, the Anzac myth. Suddenly, it's a celebration of all good things Australian. Okay, part of the story of Australia as being part of the story of forgetting where we come from in truth and losing contact with the reality of where we come from, which is the deal we signed up to in 1996 to be relaxed and comfortable. Part of the deal with that is we have lost contact with reality as a nation. We still need to tell a story about ourselves, but now we can't go to the truth and to our own history to tell that story. We've actually got to create it. So in creating the story about who we are now, we don't have a new story to tell. We severed our relationship with that emerging story. So we've got to revert to what we know. And what we know is that England is motherland, that forget Kokoda, Anzac is where it's at, and that white is good. So we are caught tracking back to that reality. And there are all sorts of, we produce artifacts like that. We produce the artifact of this kind of ecstatic Anzac celebration when, when I was growing up, really, it just was, maybe it should have been, but it wasn't. And we reconnect our links to the homeland, and we get massive multi-million-dollar grants from sponsors on the condition that universities run programs talking about how great the West is. So all of that movement forward, we have lost. And meanwhile, so what are we doing with refugees at that point? The reason I raise the fact that psychologically we are always in a state of movement forward or devolution. That's just, I don't make the rules, I just observe them here. We're always in that state because we had that deal with ourselves, the agreement to ignore the truth. It means that we are recalibrating all the time to try and defend ourselves against the truth of who we are. Over the last 25 years, our treatment of refugees has gone from bad to horrific. Right now on Nauru, security is run by a bikie gang. Over the last 25 years, we have seen children, young women, fellas murdered, systematically raped, abused, die from neglect. We have seen the most shameful behaviour, and we have been the perpetrators of that.
So why are we tolerating it? I mean, the standard line is the standard you walk by is the standard you accept. We can't pretend we don't know what's going on in Nauru. Why is it acceptable?
Well, two things then. We can pretend we don't know, and we have been pretending that we don't know. And two, even when it's foisted upon us, the reality of that, we've got a whole lot of backstories to tell ourselves about that. We tell ourselves, well, at least they're not drowning at sea. And of course, the solution to having people drown at sea is to send the Navy to rescue them. The second solution to prevent people drowning at sea is to have them fly here from Indonesia after we'd processed them. But right now, that's a story we tell ourselves. And most importantly, given that we've walked away from our own humanity in that deal, we tell ourselves that they're not like us, they are other than us, and we ascribe to them, as particularly coalition ministers like Peter Dutton and others have done throughout. We suggest they're pedophiles, we suggest they're terrorists, we suggest they throw their children overboard. We suggest all of these things, and all of those suggestions protect us from acknowledging that they are precisely like us. This is any smart, brave person would do exactly the same thing in their position. So we managed to do that. But the cost of doing that, and I guess that's really, in a sense, what I wanted to talk about. This is not a cost-free proposition for non-Indigenous Australians. Have a look at Australia today. Freud argued that in the melancholic state, you were caught in a cycle of compulsive repetition, that the individual is never able to break free from this. Have a look at how we're dealing with climate change. Have a look at how we're dealing with the housing crisis, with rising inequality. Tonight's the budget. Have a look at what we're going to do about all the really major issues that we're confronting as a nation. And if you really want to scare yourself, have a look at how we're relating to the US under Trump. We are in a very bad way in Australia. We have proven ourselves to be unable to deal realistically with the facts on the ground of climate change. We are brutalising and taking First Nations kids from their families at an historic rate. You know, the Stolen Children report, if we had a Royal Commission today, the numbers would be so much worse. Inequality, intergenerational theft, all of that For a rich, educated country like Australia, we're in a very bad way. We are caught in this compulsive repetition.
So where did the notion of illegal refugees come from? Isn't it any individual's legal right to seek asylum if they're in fear where they are?
Yeah, it is. There is nothing illegal about seeking asylum, but I think it was under Scott Morrison that he directed the department to only refer to actually use that term actively. And I guess what worries me about that as a former journalist, I've got to look at that and go, why, as journalists, did we not handle that situation better? For instance, all of this stuff about asylum seekers, because they were offshore, the government controlled the frame and the messaging all the way through. If the journalists, as journalists, we had collectively said to the government, we are not going to report anything you say about this until we have access to the people you're referring to in order to get their side of the story. Like we would in any other situation. He said, she said. It may not be great journalism, but it is pretty basic. If we had maintained the discipline around that collectively, everything would be different.
So why do we treat differently people who arrive in leaky boats from, I suspect, the much larger number of asylum seekers who arrive on commercial aircraft?
Well, it goes back to our origin story, doesn't it? You know, we arrived in boats and you know, you don't need to be Freud to have a look at that and go, of course we're terrified of people who arrive in boats because we remember on a very ancient level, we remember what we did as a white Australian, what we did when we arrived by boats. We tried to eradicate every person we came across. We stole the land, we stole the children, we stole the culture. That's what people do when they arrive by boat, right? So, of course, when we see all these boats washing up here, we go hysterical. And we go hysterical because we have not psychologically processed what we did.
So
Can't hear you, Ian.
So there's a direct link to the record of our ancestors, the dispossession, the organised murdering, raping, distribution of poison flour, all of the atrocities which, in a sense, modern historians like Henry Reynolds and the late Lyndall Ryan have alerted us to, but was not part of the story you and I learnt in Australian history at school. We learnt of Captain Cook, we learnt of the explorers, we learnt of the brave forebears who opened mines or opened grazing territory, but we were never, it was assumed that the first Australians had simply melted away and allowed us to take possession of their land.
Well, that's right. And I mean, we talk about that as being a past, but if any of you have read Tony Abbott's book, you'll understand that there are still people around who think that white Australia was the best thing for First Nations people. But once you walk away from the truth of that, you're in trouble. You're in deep trouble. And that, you know, that's why I think there is a real connection between the treatment of First Nations people in the foundation of Australia and the treatment of asylum seekers. And the other thing I'd say too is, I can't remember who said it, but some clever person made the comment that in a psychological world, there is no past, present, future. In psychologically speaking, everything is current. That's why psychotherapy works, because you might be talking about something that happened when you're a 7-year-old, but it is the driver for your actions today. And in that sense, time is a lot more like how traditional owners understand time. Psychological time is a lot more like that. If we take that seriously, then the deal we made with Howard to forget our past, the deal we made with each other to pretend that actually the abuse of asylum seekers is a completely reasonable proposition, we will come to grips with that. It will force us to come to grips with dealing with that and being held to account for that. And that's why reality matters. That's why getting the truth of our colonisation front and centre matters, to be honest, not so much for First Nations people. It matters desperately to contemporary Australia because we have seen each other do appalling things. We have seen our nation allow the abuse and certainly torment of asylum seekers, and we've watched it happen. A lot of focus is often put on victims and perpetrators, but in Australia, we need to have a big discussion about bystanders, about what we have agreed to observe and to not prevent. Because I think that's why we've got all our social indicators describe a very sad nation. You know, suicide, loneliness, mental ill health, all the indicators that say, how is this nation going? They're not good, and nor would they be, because we understand ourselves to be a people capable of terrible things, even if we don't consciously accept the truth of that. And that's why Australia needs a therapist, quite frankly. It really does. It really does. Because the other part of doing this research, and the really hopeful part for me, because you'd be surprised to hear that looking at the question of torture for 4 years was a pretty grim process. But the part that I draw really great hope from, part of my research, and it's in the book, was interviewing 5 psychiatrists who had worked with asylum seekers over the last 2 decades, and to ask them a series of questions about how they found it. And, you know, I thought the interesting question was the last one, which was, if Australia was your patient and walked in, how would you treat Australia? And most of them said they'd call the police, but given there aren't any police. But what really came out of that was the kind of revelation to me that of all the people who were caught up in Australia's immigration regime and its brutality, the people that survived what Winnicott used to call with their sacred core intact were the people who engaged in political action. And it wasn't pleasant political action. It was visceral, it was lip sewing, it was digging their own graves, it was jumping into barbed wire, it was hunger strikes. Those people who took political action survived psychologically whole. And I take from that a great deal of hope. I take from that the idea that that psychological action done in concert with each other is restorative. And I take from that even when that political action is really frowned upon, you know, no one was clapping when people were sewing their lips together. Everyone was horrified. But even when it is unacceptable, it carries with it the germ of recovery. It carries with it agency and creativity and solidarity.
That's really, really moving. Julianne asked, can we put the failure of the voice referendum into this context?
Yeah.
And I regarded the Uluru Statement from the Heart as an extraordinarily warm and generous offer from the people who had been brutalised and dispossessed of a way forward which we could both communities could walk with dignity. And I had a moment of joy in my heart when Anthony Albanese was elected, and his very first statement in the 2022 election was that he would implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full, voice, truth, treaty. Does the failure of that referendum realise that that healing process has not occurred, that we are still that psychologically damaged patient in urgent need of therapy to confront the blackness of our past and come to grips with the need for genuine reconciliation?
Yeah, I think we're all kind of shocked by that. I think all of us that night he won the election and the three flags are behind him, and there was a moment of real hope, and also, how cool is this? All we needed all along was the right leader and we could get the hell out of Dodge. This is a good thing. So there was enormous optimism with that. But the reason the vote on the voice failed is because we have failed to understand the depth and breadth of the racism that exists as a result of our denial. We can't deny the violence of colonisation without having at the heart of ourselves a profound racism. The fact, I know a lot of people were shocked that it seemed like, oh my God, it's such a small ask. It should have been a much bigger ask, but it's such a small ask. Of course, it'll get over the line. And then we see these kind of crazy, racist kind of campaign start. And I'm thinking, call me an elitist, but I'm looking at this thinking, that's crazy. That's never going to fly, because I was like many other people, not taking into account the depth of our damage and the depth of our denial and the depth of our racism and the compulsive repetition that is part and parcel of this melancholic psychological state that also thrives on what Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid position. You're either with me or against me. It's this very primitive split way that an infant manages the terror of the world. And the reason it sings for us is because we are caught in this very primitive psychological state. But I think the voice, and I've also been thinking a lot about Kevin Rudd's apology, because I thought, again, I thought things would get better under Rudd. I thought again that one political leader could lift us out of this terrible quagmire and ennui that had enveloped us. And of course it didn't work. Of course he wasn't able to lift the nation. And while the apology was desperately needed, of course it didn't have the carry through, because there was no kind of, I'm really sorry, we have thieved off you guys for the last 230 years and we're going to pay you back. There was none of that. It had no roots. I was thinking of that gospel story about, the guy who scatters the seed, and some dies, and some grows in rocky ground, and some shoots up that dies in the midday sun. It's like that. The seed was planted on very shallow, burnt ground that had no hope of carrying it to fruition. And that's what we're seeing time and time again. There is no fruition in this country. Nothing is bearing fruit, and to get that deeper soil, to reach deep into that means reaching really deep into our past and settling on the truth of who we are. We will always be a burnt out stump of a country. Hate to say it, but it's going to get a whole lot worse for us if we don't really collectively come to grips with the reality of our nation, of our past, and of what we're doing right now.
I have to ask you if the Farrer by-election is an indication of how bad things have got. And when Pauline Hanson was expelled from the Liberal Party for making openly racist comments, and it's been her stock in trade ever since, swamped by Asians, swamped by Muslims, fear of the other. And for a few decades, the Liberal Party, along with the Labor Party, denounced the overt racism and refused to give preferences to one nation. Now, in the Farrer by-election, in an act that seems to me of colossal political stupidity, the coalition agreed to give preferences to the one nation candidate. And if you do the arithmetic, the one nation candidate got 39.4% of the vote. So 60.6 people voted for other candidates. And normally, the preferences would have flowed to the independent candidate, Michelle Thorpe, who would have been elected. But the coalition decided it would give its preferences to one nation rather than to the independent candidate. So basically they decided that being overtly racist was no longer unacceptable, that they would rather give preferences to one nation and have a person flying that flag in the parliament than see another independent in what had been a traditional Liberal seat. Is that an indication that the problem is possibly even worse than you and I had feared, that the Liberal Party now thinks it's quite okay to play footsie with overt racism?
And I think, of course, it's going to get worse, because my question is, why would it get better? If a recovery for the nation as a vital, alive. The other night, I was listening to one of my favourite podcasts, which of course is The Rest is Politics UK, which, I just love them. I just think they're so great. But they were interviewing Yanis Voukakis, and he's another, big fan of Yanis. And at one point, Rory says to him, Yanis, you left England under Margaret Thatcher and then went to Australia. That seems like a strange move. And Yanis says, yeah, well, that was late 1970s, early 80s. And let me describe the Australia I moved to. There were bands everywhere. The pubs were crowded. The universities were funded really well. Filmmakers were paid to make films. There was debate all over the place. It was great music. The sun was shining. It was the best place to be. And I'm like, yes, yes, I remember that Australia. Like if we ever, the thing he didn't say about that Australia was it was really chaotic and politics was exploding all over the place. And we were actually really trying to come to grips with we're trying to come to grips with a whole lot of stuff, with women's lib, with feminism, with land rights. What does this actually mean? With gay rights. Like these weren't really easy, relaxed, comfortable conversations. They were really contested ideas. Everyone had an opinion about everything and everyone talked about it all the time. And it was so alive. It was exactly what Freud described as the process of mourning, which sounds crazy, but actually, if you read the book, it'll all make sense to you. Bit of a plug there. But if we want to get back to that, if we want to get back to that alive place full of ideas and possibilities, we are going to have to work our ring off in challenging the lies that pervade everywhere. To answer your question, one nation winning that election is a precursor of what is to come. The Liberal Party will probably go into, a coalition with one nation. Meanwhile, Labor should never be let off the hook. It is the Labor Party that has introduced the most brutal asylum seeker policies over the last 2 years. It is Labor. It was our Prime Minister who looked at those women and kids coming back from Syria and made a meal out of saying they were despicable. Like a real leader doesn't do that. A real leader looks at those women and kids and says, in Australia, we've got laws. And those laws say that if you've got a passport, you can always come home. And that's available. Home is available for all of us, regardless of what we have done. That's the deal with home. Imagine if he had said that. We would feel like we have a home here. Like our entire political language has got to be enlivened with things like home, things like love, things like curiosity and compassion. And we are never going to find that in the political class in Australia because it is our own melancholic psyche that elected them. And they're not that. Sorry.
In Donald Horne's book, The Lucky Country, he said one of the things that he thought we needed to do was to have an adult conversation about what sort of society we want to become. He said that we had traditionally been an Anglo-Celtic society, denying the dispossession, but more recently denying the multicultural Australia that we were becoming, with people from a range of different countries, a range of different cultures, a range of different religions, a range of different moral perspectives. Do you think what the rise of One Nation, what the rejection of the voice shows, is that there are still a core of Australians who yearn to be back in that old, simple, white Anglo-Celtic world where we could deny the reality of dispossession, deny the reality of cultural diversity, who think that multicultural Australia is a mistake, a betrayal of our traditional values?
Ian, I think that's true, but I also think that actually we all get out of this or none of us get out of this. It's not in anyone's interest to look at people who would vote for One Nation and describe them as somehow a kind of lesser, ignorant kind of, and I've seen a lot of that in the political coverage where people have gone, this is a cohort of people driven by envy and racism, blah, 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 blah. But I suspect if we look at the people who are voting for One Nation, if we look at how neoliberalism has absolutely shredded the social safety contract we have with each other, we have neoliberalism turns all of us into atomized portfolio workers that are indeed our own brand. We are not a country. We are a group of individuals trying to hustle with a whole lot of side issues. That generates a splintering of the social contract. It generates a great deal of fear and anxiety. And Gus Anhaj writes beautifully about this and talks about if everything is taken from you, white Australia will often go, well, I might have lost access to markets and lost my job and lost my relevance and lost my security and education and hospitals. I might have lost all of that, but I'm still white, and that's got to mean something. And my heart really goes out to people who feel that because it is generated from a deep sense of loss and fear and aloneness. So, I think the solution for One Nation is, that we don't get this quasi-fascist, racist politics that Pauline Hanson and her grubby little pals espouse. But it's not to alienate people who vote for her. It's to say, if we created Australia where actually we, from the bottom of our bootstraps, promised that actually no one would be left to die in a tent on the banks of a river having just delivered your child. No one will be left not having enough food to feed their kids, not having a safe place to call home. If we actually really committed to a social democracy in Australia, One Nation would be entirely irrelevant. They'd be laughed out of town because what creates One Nation is a well-grounded fear of being abandoned by our communities. And, in the last week alone, we have seen people profoundly abandoned by us and our community. That is what generates One Nation. And that's, I think, collectively our job is to reclaim the space and the demands that we care for each other. It's interesting, you know, when Freud talked about the remedy, how does mourning produce a remedy for the person dying of a broken heart? And he argued that when we come to grips with reality, when we really recognize the depth of loss, the depth of our heartbrokenness, and we are allowed to grieve that and really speak about it, we go through a period of transformation. We go through a period which is terribly distressing. But once we come out the other side, we come out able to love. That's what we save by staying in contact with reality. That is the trophy we have by staying in contact with the heartbreak and the loss and the sadness, is we emerge able to love, which is an extraordinary thing. It is an extraordinary thing.
It certainly is. I mean, going back to the damage done by the Howard government, people no longer see housing as a social need. They talk about getting into the housing market. It's seen as a place for speculative investment rather than a roof over people's heads. And Andrew Lee's book, Battlers and Billionaires, documents the fact that Australia has become steadily, systematically less equal over the last 40 years. And it's not only Howard. I mean, it started with Hawke and Keating embracing the neoliberal economic agenda, so that we have more multimillionaires than we've ever had, and we have more people living on the streets than we ever had. How do we reverse that process and rebuild the understanding that we're all in this together, and that our society should be and is judged by how we treat the least advantaged of us?
I think for a start, I think public policy comes out of our psychological state. It emanates from who we are. So if the policy emanating from us collectively is a neoliberal agenda that turns homes into investment options, that turns communities into sacrifice zones, that turns workers into portfolio gig economy workers, then we need to reject the whole neoliberal proposition. But this is why I think the psychology of the nation matters primarily and in first place, because all of these policies are coming out of who we are. So if we were able to really come to grips with the truth of who we are, the policies that come from that place are humane policies. Right now, we do not have humane policies. We have $400 billion going to the US for submarines that will never turn up, in order for the US to turn us into what they call the aircraft carrier in the Pacific. And we're going to give them $400 billion in order to take our sovereignty for us. Like, this is the most humiliating deal ever done. And our response to that as a nation is, yeah, what ifs? Like, we have got to start holding the line on these things. We have got to start using language again. Wendy Brown, the US academic, talks really beautifully about how neoliberalism, one of its major triumphs is it stole our language. We no longer use the language of the heart. We buy into talking about human beings as human resources, as if they're a truck or a mining site. We use that term all along, unconsciously. We use KPIs. We use a whole lot of ridiculous language to dehumanize each other. So it is about kind of going through this painstaking work. And Freud talked about the process of mourning sometimes takes us through into a psychotic episode. Just something to look forward to, I guess. But he talks about this painstaking work of looking at the artifacts, of remembering what we've lost, of spending time and finding ways through music and art and ceremony and language to reconnect with the truth. This is painstaking work. It's the work we've got to do. It's absolutely the work we've got to do individually and collectively. And I just really want to underscore that I think we can really draw deep hope from the fact that we are seeing signs in our broader community that things can turn around. You know, I have never been to so many demonstrations as I have in the last 5 years. And I see that as a sign of enormous hope, whatever it is, but women's justice demos, Black Lives Matter demos, demos for Palestine. Like, these are the signs of life returning. They're really important.
That leads me to what I think was what I took as the most important lesson of your book, that if we face the past, if we recognise the lie of terra nullius, if we recognise the myth of the kindly settler, recognise the injustice that was done, then there is a hope that we can face the future and embrace those who come across the sea, for whom we say in our anthem we have boundless plains to share. Is the fact that human systems are non-linear and can change to a radically different state what gives you hope?
Yeah, and Ian, you're the expert on non-linear, spontaneous change of a species. I do know that. But yes, this is the thing, right? Like, I'm intrigued by how absolutely absurd stuff, like what Donald Trump's doing in Iran, right? Total crazy town. The man should have been given a holiday a long time ago. He could blow us all up because he lives in crazy town, right? Now, that has been kind of normalized, but journalists treat this as if it somehow makes total sense, you know, that he's going to nuke an entire nation. So that's on the negative side of it. We have been able to normalize abusing the most vulnerable people on earth, and we think that's normal, right? The opposite is true too. We can slowly begin to normalize the fact that, of course, if we see someone being hurt, we'll interrupt it. Of course, if we see damage done, we'll step in. And it starts slowly, but before you know it, suddenly it's a given that, yeah, of course, we always do that. That's who we are. That's how we roll, you know? It happens, it starts slowly, but at some point, as you would know from your own research, suddenly everything changes overnight, and it's as if we always thought this way.
And you can see that in our recent past. The idea that the Australia in which we grew up could vote overwhelmingly to legalise same-sex marriage would have seemed a ridiculous fantasy when we were young. And I remind people that in about 6 months in 2007, John Howard went from being unassailable to being unelectable. He went from being one of our longest-serving prime ministers to lose his own seat. We're out of time, Julie. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for writing this book and for giving us hope that we can achieve that non-linear change to an Australia that is just, an Australia that is humane, and an Australia that faces its future with confidence because we have faced our past.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. And thanks for reading it too.
It was troubling, but you need to be shaken out of your comfort zone and forced to face the reality that we are accepting the inhumane treatment of refugees on our behalf by our elected government.
Thanks, Ian, and good night to everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Faces.
Buy the book, read the book, and if you know a politician who thinks about these issues, give them a copy and urge them to read it. Thank you so much.